everyone, thanks for joining us. Let's get started with our slideshow on organic pest and disease control. I want to start out the session today by looking at the concept of integrated pest management. So this is a system that combines cultural, biological, physical, and chemical strategies to control pests and diseases. So what does that mean? So cultural strategies, these are going to be things like crop rotation, trap cropping, polyculture, also known as companion planting, variety selection, and then good garden practices like providing air circulation, excellent drainage, conserving soil moisture, and building soil health. We're going to talk more in depth about some of those first concepts that I listed in this section in this class today. And then biological strategies, this is mostly what I'm going to be talking about today are beneficial insects. So this is going to be like your predator insects that are going to be eating your pest insects. And then physical and mechanical strategies, these are things like hand picking, so going out there and just collecting the pest insects or the pests in general, and using things like sticky traps and then solarization, and that's where you are actually sterilizing your soil using heat from the sun. And then you have chemical strategies is the last thing that you would resort to. And so this is going to be using the least toxic chemical spray first, and then resorting to more toxic organic pesticides only if you really have to. And one important thing to keep in mind about using chemical controls is that most sprays, most organic sprays, many of them are non-selective, which means they will kill your beneficial insects as well as your pest insects. So they could potentially kill your honeybees, which are another form of beneficial insect, or your predator insects as well. So we really want to be mindful about that if we resort to a chemical pest control method. So the first cultural concept that I want to look more closely at is crop rotation. And so this very basically is the system of rotating your plant families. And so all of the vegetables that we grow, the annual vegetables that we grow, they fall into different plant families. And there are pests and diseases that have specifically evolved to rely on and prey on those plant families. So essentially what you do with crop rotation is you move those plant families around to different spaces in your garden over the course of time in order to avoid the buildup of pests and diseases. And the other reason that we rotate our crops is to manage soil fertility. So certain crops are heavy feeders, which means they use a lot of nutrients to grow, like corn, for example. And some crops can require less nutrients to grow, and they can even leave behind some residual nutrients in the soil, for example, the bean family or the Fabaceae family. So you can get strategic with, which group you're going to follow as a way to manage the soil nutrients. So for example, you could grow beans, which may leave behind a little bit of nitrogen in the soil, and then the following year in that same spot, you could grow corn, which requires extra nitrogen to grow really well. So it's a way to manage your soil fertility as well. So as you can see on this slide, there are a lot of different plant families. This slide right here is showing 9 different families. And so I know a lot of us have smaller gardens, and so it can be challenging to figure out how to rotate all of those different things really in an organized way. So this is just something to think about. Crop rotation is something to try and to experiment with. And so I wanted to show this example here, this table, and this is just sort of a simplified version. And so it's broken up into 4 different areas, and you can see it spans across the course of 4 years. And we're looking at 4 different groups of plants. So like the bean family, squash and melon family, a cover crop, and a tomato family. And what you're doing is you take your garden, divide it up into 4 areas. Year 1, you have all of these different plants grouped into these different areas. And then the next year, you rotate out. So you put in a new plant family. So you can see area 1, as you go across time, it's got the bean family in year 1. Next year, you're going to put the squash family in. The next year, you're going to put a cover crop in. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about cover crops. And then the next year, you would put a tomato family in. So over the course of 4 years, that one spot in your garden is going to be having different groups of plants, different plant families each year. So that's one example, kind of a simplified version. So to talk about the cover crops, it's great if you can integrate in, rotate in a cover crop. And these are going to be multifunction plants that can do a variety of things. They're not plants that we grow to harvest the fruit off of or to harvest the vegetables off of. They're plants that we grow just to feed our soil. So the healthier our soil is, the healthier our plants are going to be, the less likely they're going to be to fall prey to pests and diseases. So the cover crops are going to improve your soil fertility and your structure. They're going to protect your soil from erosion and compaction. So having something growing on your soil at all times helps to protect your soil from blowing away in the wind. And when rains come, it helps, disperse those raindrops into smaller droplets so that it doesn't pack your soil down. They can also conserve soil moisture. They can often attract beneficial insects. So this picture that we have here is crimson clover. And you can see this little, if you see down in the right-hand corner of the slide, there's that little bug right there. That is a baby ladybug, and that's a beneficial insect. Cover crops can repel pests, and I'll talk more about that. They can prevent weeds. So if you have, plants that you want to grow in your garden taking up space, that's one less spot that a weed can grow. So it's better to be purposeful with the plants that you have rather than just, leaving it bare so weeds can move in. They can also provide aesthetic value and, just make a garden prettier. And so there are 3 main families of cover crops that people grow, and those are the legumes. That's like the bean family. There are the grasses, and the grasses are great for adding like bulk to your soil. They add a large amount of organic matter. And then you've got your brassicas, which is like your mustards. So those are kind of the 3 main groups that you'll see. There are a lot of different cover crops out there that you can experiment with. I got really interested in working a mustard cover crop into my rotation at the kitchen garden. And the big reason that I was excited about it is because there's a particular type of mustard called mighty mustard that has been selected or bred to have especially high levels of mustard oil. And those oils that are in the plant, when the plant is integrated, when the leaves are integrated into the soil, they break down and they release that oil into the soil, and it can suppress root knot nematodes. So the picture on the left that you see is an illustration of some roots that are infected with root knot nematodes, and that is a pretty common pest here in the Southeast and in other areas. There are beneficial nematodes, but there are also these detrimental nematodes, and so I have them in a lot of my raised beds at UT gardens. And so I rotate in a mighty mustard cover crop, and after I've grown the cover crop and I've integrated those leaves into the soil, and then I've waited 3 weeks, I can plant vegetables that are susceptible to soil nematodes, and I'll be able to get a crop out of them because the populations of the root knot nematodes will be beaten back by those mustard oils. And then also the mustard is adding organic matter to the soil, and when I let it flower, it's attracting bees and supporting my beneficial insects. So it's a really interesting one to try. My other, one of my top cover crops is crimson clover. This is one of the more common ones, and it is in the legume family. And so it has the ability to fix nitrogen in the soil. So it's a way to actually boost the fertility of your soil. And it's beautiful. As you can see, these beautiful red flowers. And the picture on the right, you can see this is just one of our raised beds at UT Gardens. And we are mid weed whacking it to the ground. So you seed the crimson clover in the fall and it overwinters, and then in the spring it grows up and it's flowering about now. Now through about early May is when it usually flowers. And once it's in flower, you cut it down, and you can either integrate the top growth into the soil, or you can just leave it on top of the soil like a mulch. And then the roots that are in the soil will break down, and as they break down, they'll release a little bit of nitrogen into your soil. So it's like you grow your own fertilizer. So the last cover crop I want to look at is this sun hemp, and it's cool because it has characteristics of both of the two that I just talked about. So it is in the legume family, so it fixes nitrogen, but it's also a nematode suppressant. So you can get pest control, and you can add soil fertility by cover cropping with sun hemp or crotalaria. So moving on to polyculture or interplanting, and this is when I talk about companion planting, this is usually what I'm talking about. And what this is a system where you grow 2 or more crops in right next to each other to promote beneficial interactions between the two. And what we have here are peppers. You can see these black peppers here. So those are a type of bell pepper, and I've got them mixed up with 4 or 5 other plants. I've got rosemary growing in here. I have hyacinth bean growing, amaranth you can see in the top right corner, and morning glory. So entomologists have studied some pest insects and found that they like to send in scouts to test out an area before they bring in the rest of the family, so to speak. So they will send out scouts, and the scouts will go to an area and they'll test plants to see if this is a desirable spot for everybody to move in. So if the scout insect tests the first leaf and finds that it's a pepper leaf, then they might say, all right, great, this is where we want to go. But if the second leaf they test is a rosemary, and then the third is, say, a hyacinth bean, and the fourth is a morning glory, they actually seem to, I don't know if they get confused or if they're able to just say, this isn't easy enough, or what exactly the mechanism is, but they will often not settle in there if they find that there are too many different things going on, too many different plants growing in one area, as opposed to a situation where if you had all pepper plants, then every single leaf that they landed on would be a pepper leaf, right? And they'd be like, yeah, let's do it. This is a great place to be. And then they would bring everybody else in, and you could get an infestation. So this has been quite successful for me. We have a lot of brown marmorated stink bugs, and by mixing up my plants as much as possible, I can disguise some of my my desirable plants, my crop plants, and avoid some of those pest issues. So this is known as polyculture or interplanting, and the big things to remember about this is you want to have as many species as possible. So just having 2, your cash crop and your distractor plant is generally not enough. Scientists have found that the more variety that there is, the more success you will have. And then you want to think about timing. So it's great if you can have all of these things thriving, blooming, growing around the same time. So like if you grow, plant a row of tomatoes and you've got 15 tomato plants growing in a row, and then you start to see some pests coming in, and you think, all right, we're going to do some companion planting, and you stick like a marigold out there at the end of the row, that's not going to really help, right? So what you really need to do is plant marigolds like all up in your tomato bed, and plant like a lot of other different plants in there if you want to experiment with this interplanting method. One other thing, I like to use containers. So I like to put my herbs, like the intensely smelling herbs like rosemary and mint, put them in a container, and then I can just stick my container around in different spots, or have multiple containers that I move around. And that's one way to bring in some of those perennial herbs into the mix without having to actually plant them in the bed, is just keep them in a container. So this is a book that I found. If you haven't seen it before, I encourage you to check it out. It's one of my favorite vegetable garden books. It's Great Garden Companions, and it was written by a master gardener out of Cornell University. And so she has taken these two concepts and sort of combined them. So she's got crop rotation combined with companion planting in this strategy that it utilizes garden neighborhoods. So it's like taking plants from, say, the tomato family or the Solanaceae family, and she has studied what other plants they seem to grow, pretty well with, and then she rotates those groups of plants or those neighborhoods around the garden. So in that way, you're able to get some of the benefits of companion planting, polyculture, combined with a crop rotation strategy. So she goes all into it, but it's definitely an interesting one to check out if you want to do more companion planting and combine that with crop rotation. And this is an example in the kitchen garden of one year. We had a bed where we grew, we had a plant neighborhood going on, right? So it was the Solanaceae family. So I've got the tomatoes growing in the middle here, and then I've got this pepper plant, which is another member of that same family. They are prone to some of the same pests and diseases. So they're growing together like companions, and I have them mixed with herbs like germander over to the right, and as well as flowers and some parsley. And so that was a whole neighborhood that I could then rotate to a different bed the next year. So just to tie up, crop rotation, what I really want to say about it, a few points. Main point, one is, I think if you had to choose one plant to be really fastidious with rotating, I would say tomatoes are one that I really do think it's worth taking the time to figure out how to rotate those around in your garden. Try not to plant tomatoes in the same spot year after year. They're very popular. I think they are the most popular vegetable to grow, and I feel like they have some more problems than almost any other vegetable. So they got a lot of pests and a lot of diseases that can build up with tomatoes. So do your best to rotate those around the garden in different spots. Ideally, you would want to do 3 to 5 years where you are not you're putting a tomato in one spot, and then you're waiting 3 to 5 years before you're going to put a tomato in that same spot again. I would say do the best you can. I know that, large scale agricultural producers, they are working with acres of land. They have tons of space to really do perfect crop rotation. And if you have a small garden, it can be really challenging. But the more that you do, the better results you're going to have. So just try, do the best you can. Luckily, home gardens are really forgiving because we can top dress with compost. So every time we add that 3-inch layer of compost, we're enhancing the soil and we're changing the soil a little bit. So we can get away with less perfect crop rotation than, say, a large scale producer because we're adding all these amendments to our soil, hopefully, because we're taking care of our soil. So by doing that, you can get away with less than perfect crop rotation. But again, do the best you can and try it out.
Holly, we have a question.
Okay.
He said, you may have said this, but with cover crop, how do you time when to cut it versus when to plant the desired new crop?
Right. So it varies depending on what cover crop you're using, because there are so many different kinds. They have different life cycles and different growth habits, but generally, like, okay, I'll use crimson clover as an example. You want to cut it down when the plant is at least, when the entire population of your cover crop is at least 30% in bloom. And one reason you want to wait for it to bloom is that if you don't let it bloom and you cut it down too early, you have the possibility that it'll resprout. But if you wait for it to start blooming and then you cut it down, the plant, quote unquote, thinks that it's completed its life cycle, and so it's more likely to stay dead. So you do want to let them start to flower, but you don't want to let them go too far into flower if it's something like crimson clover, because you're trying to harvest that nitrogen for your own garden. And if you let them flower all the way and form seeds, then the plant is going to utilize the nitrogen that it formed for its own purposes to set seed. So you want to kill it before it's able to set seed so that you're going to maximize your nitrogen for the garden. And then it just depends as far as like how long is it going to tie your bed up? When can you plant your new crop? It varies, from species to species. Some cover crops break down faster, like buckwheat, for example, will break down pretty fast. So I have planted in a bed that was covered cropped with buckwheat within like a week of cutting it down. But if you use something like a grass or like an oats, those can take a really long time to break down, and your bed may be tied up for a month. So I don't have an easy answer, but just read up on it when you decide which cover crop you want to use, and know that, yes, it is going to tie your bed up a little bit, and that can be a little bit frustrating if you have to wait like a couple weeks until you can plant, because you're waiting for the cover crop to break down. But if you can be patient, I think it is worth it because it really enhances your soil. All right, so let's move on to trap crops. And trap cropping is where you grow, you have the cash crop, or the crop that you're wanting to harvest, and you grow something that's more attractive to pests right next to that. So sorry, I just saw a question pop up. Somebody's asking,
it just now popped up. Where do you buy the cover crops?
Yeah, so you can order them online. I use an organization, a group called High Mowing Organic Seeds. They're a great resource. Johnny's Selected Seeds, they have good selection of cover crops. Those are probably my two main ones. You can also go to your local farmers co-op, and they will have a lot of the common cover crop seeds. Okay, so trap cropping. So this is where you got one plant that you're trying to grow and you want to harvest the vegetables off of, and then you have another plant that you grow right next to it, and you know that that other plant is more attractive to the pest insect, and you wait for the pest insect to be attracted to that trap crop, and then to get a high population there. And once you see that there are a lot of your pests on the trap crop, you kill them. So you might use mechanical methods, like you could use, like what I've done before is to have take just a black trash bag, and I just pulled up my trap crop by the roots, and I just immediately stuffed it in a black trash bag, and then I just tied that up really tight, and it suffocated the pest insects. Or you can spray an insecticide on your trap crop. So this picture here just shows a trap crop experiment that one organization did, and what you see in the middle is mustard, and they had a really bad problem with crucifer flea beetles, and so they were growing the mustard as a trap crop for the flea beetles. And on either side you can see those lighter green leaves. Those are some type of brassica, I think it was broccoli. And so they knew that the flea beetle was a bad pest of the broccoli, so they grew the mustard in the middle, and all the flea beetles went to the mustard, and then they were able to just take out the mustard crop, and their brassicas, the broccoli, was left unbothered. Couple of potential challenges with trap cropping. One is if you decide to trap crop, you need to be committed to dealing with those pests once they congregate. So if you put in a trap crop and you just forget about it and it attracts all these pest insects and you don't do anything to control it, you could actually create a little nursery of pests and actually be having more pests in your garden. So you do want to, be committed to your plan, know that you're going to need to deal with it. You're going to need to watch the trap crop and see when those pest populations get to a high level, and then be committed to deal with them. And the other thing to keep in mind is that if you decide to use insecticides or pesticides on your trap crop, it is possible that insects can develop resistance to certain pesticides, and you may have natural pest predators that come into that trap crop, and so you may be taking out some beneficial insects as well. So those are just a couple of things to keep in mind. One other method that you can use to isolate your plants from pests is row covers. So this is a material it's called Agribon, and it's a lightweight fabric that is readily available from I know Johnny's Selected Seeds, they carry it. It's fairly easy to find. It comes in a big roll, and it's very effective. It lets the light in, but it keeps the pests out. If you're going to grow something that requires pollination, you do need to pull this cover off once the plants start to flower, so that the pollinators can get in there and pollinate them. Or you can grow plants that don't require pollination or are self-pollinating, and then all you have to do is lift up the Agribon when it's time to harvest them. But this is a really effective way to isolate your plants from pests, and it's great for things like eggplants. If you have flea beetle problems, you can just grow them under cover, and you can let them grow up to a nice mature size, and then you can pull off the cover, and once the plants are large and healthy and stable, they can withstand a little bit of flea beetle pressure, and it won't actually kill the plant. So it's a good method. My one issue with the row covers is it does require a frame, and so you do need to get in there. This frame in this picture is just, I think it might be irrigation pipe and PVC. So there are some pretty simple methods. You can make some little tunnels, and then you just clip on the Agribon over that. I don't love the way it looks, but I gotta say it is very effective. So next thing to look at is variety selection. So one thing you can do that is going to be very beneficial is to figure out what your top diseases are, and then choose varieties that have been bred to be resistant to those diseases. So this slide is from the extension services out of the University of Florida, and it just shows all the different vegetables that have existing varieties that were created to be resistant to these specific diseases. So lots and lots of breeding has been done to create these varieties that are resistant to a lot of these problems. So I have this at the bottom, tomato highlighted. So there are tomatoes that have been bred to be resistant to root knot nematodes. So I know that's one of the problems I have. I can choose, that can help inform me of which tomato varieties I should be growing in my beds that have root knot nematodes. There are over 100 disease codes that you'll find attached to plant varieties, and a lot of seed catalogs will have those disease codes in the back, and they'll tell you what they stand for. And then as you're flipping through the different varieties, you can look for those disease codes, and you can choose the ones that you know are going to be resistant to the issues that you have. Another thing to think about with variety selection is just deciding to like the plants that grow well in your area. So depending on where you live, certain things are going to be easier to grow. If you live in the tropics, obviously it's going to be easier to grow things like pineapple and mango. But if you live in the tropics, it may be really hard for you to grow like apples or raspberries. So wherever you are, figure out what wants to grow here and let that be what you decide to like. Learn to love it. So what are a few things that like to grow in Tennessee? I found, okra grows wonderfully for us. Sweet potatoes, herbs, butternut squash. Those are just a couple, few examples of things that seem to grow really well here. Muscadines versus table grapes. I used to grow table grapes, like the sweet ones, at UT Gardens, but I found that to my knowledge, there are no table grapes that don't require some type of spraying. And I am limited on the amount of time that I have. So there are organic sprays that you can use to control the many fungus issues that table grapes have. But you got to take the time to get out there and put your backpack sprayer on and actually apply the sprays. So one way around it is to grow muscadines. These are native to Tennessee and to the southeast, and they do really well. They grow like crazy for us here. They're a little different from table grapes, but they are a fruiting perennial vine that grows amazingly well and doesn't require any spraying. Zucchetta rampicante versus zucchini. So this is Zucchetta rampicante is a squash that is similar to zucchini in flavor. It's a little more substantial, like it's not as light as a zucchini when you're slicing it, but it can be used in a lot of the same recipes that call for zucchini. And the reason that you might want to grow it instead of zucchini is because of the squash vine borer. So in the top right, you can see that little white grub, and there's a moth that injects its egg into the stem of the zucchini, and the little grub grows up inside of there and eats the stem from the inside out. And it's a real frustrating problem if you're trying to grow zucchini. So the Zucchetta rampicante, the stem is so hard that the moth isn't able to penetrate the stem, so it can't lay its eggs in there. So that's, one way to avoid the problem altogether might be to just grow something completely different. All right, so let's change gears a little bit here, and we're going to look at some biological controls. So I want to talk about good bugs and bad bugs. There are, according to the Smithsonian Institute, there are 900,000 different kinds of living insects in the world. There are approximately 91,000 species in the US alone, and only 5% of these insects are harmful or bothersome to humans, and 95% of them are either good or neutral. So that's just something to keep in mind. We think about insects a lot as being, bothering us and issues, and we think about the bad ones, but the fact is there are tons and tons of insects, and most of them are actually not doing anything bad to us as humans, and some of them are actually helping us as gardeners. So what are those different beneficial insects? There are different kinds. This is one way to look at it. You can break them up into 3 groups. You got your pollinators. Another type of beneficial insect are your predators, and those are the insects that are they are carnivores, and so they're going to live on other insects. Many of those are pest insects, and we're going to look at a few of those specifically. And then you've got your recyclers, who are, breaking down fresh organic matter into smaller bits. And those are like the roaches and crickets and beetles. So lots of different kinds of beneficial insects. I want to look at one, this hoverfly. This is one that does double duty in the garden. So the next few slides are some specific beneficial insects that I have found in my garden here in Knoxville, and they're probably ones that may be common for you all as well. So the hoverfly is one that is helpful in two ways. As an adult, it's a great pollinator. It's close in value to bees. It's a very active pollinator in the garden. And then as a larva, it is a predator. And so on the right, you can see when it's like a little larva, that is when it's going to eat aphids, scales, thrips, all those small soft-bodied insects, and it will eat a lot of them. So one insect, double duty, very beneficial.
Hoverfly. I have a question.
Yes.
What category are slugs, worms, and grubs in?
Those, as far as how I categorized them, those would be recyclers. Another one to look at are parasitic wasps. So these are tiny little wasps. This is just one example. There are a lot of different kinds of them. And they don't harm humans. They don't sting humans. They're really, really small. But what they do is they inject their eggs into caterpillars. And you can see on the right here, this is a tomato hornworm caterpillar. And all those little white, like grains of rice on there, they're little cocoons. And so each one of those has a baby parasitic wasp in it. And they are using the energy from that caterpillar to develop. So they are parasitizing or eating the caterpillar. So these are amazing. And I have tomato hornworms in my garden, and I didn't even realize I had them until I found one, and it looked exactly like this. It already had all of those little cocoons all over it. So I didn't even have to do anything. I just left it there, and I let the wasps do the work for me. And all I had to do was grow flowers to attract the parasitic wasps. Another one that I think, most people, this is probably the poster child for beneficial insects, for predator insects. It's the lady beetle. And I just want to look at the different stages of development of the lady beetle because they look different at different stages. And so on the first picture that we see here, those are the little eggs. So if you see these eggs out in the garden, you don't just immediately want to smash them. You want to figure out maybe what they are, because they could hatch into the next stage of development of the ladybug, which is an extremely beneficial predator insect in your garden. They eat all kinds of aphids, mealybugs, a lot of tiny soft-bodied insects that are going to be eating your vegetable plants and your flower plants. And they look at this stage quite different from the adult. And then the next stage of metamorphosis that they go through is this little foamy structure here. And that's when they're developing into the ladybug that we all know and love. So they look very different all across their different stages of development. And so I'm always trying to learn what are the insects that I see in my garden, and then what do they look like as they develop across their life cycle, so that I can recognize them at all their different life cycles and know whether to destroy them if they're pests or to, protect them and help them if they're beneficial insects. This is another example of beneficial. This is the pink spotted ladybug, and this is one that I just learned about in the last couple of years. It's a native to Tennessee, and it is cool because it's cool because it's a predator and it eats pest insects, but it's also, it wants a more varied diet, so it requires some pollen and nectar in the garden. So you have to grow a lot of flowers if you want to have these pink spotted lady beetles. It likes its pollen and its nectar and its insects as part of its diet.
Ollie, we have a question.
Sure.
Are the Japanese beetles that look like ladybugs also beneficial?
Japanese beetles, those are the really iridescent ones, and those are a vector for a disease, and I know they're a major pest. So I don't, if they're the Japanese beetles that I think you're talking about, the answer is no, we don't consider them to be beneficial. That said, they may be adding some positive element to the ecosystem that I'm not aware of, but as a gardener, I generally think of them as a pest and try to eradicate them. Oh, I just wanted to show you all this, the eggs that are being eaten right here by the pink spotted lady beetle. Those are Colorado potato beetles, eggs. So there you go. This little pink spotted lady beetle is eating a pest insect before it even has a chance to develop into a pest. A couple lookalikes. The Mexican bean beetle, this is really common, and it's a major pest on beans. This is what the little nymph looks like, or the immature stage. It's like a little fat yellow grain here, and it's got little spikes coming off of it. So if you see, usually I see these on my beans before I even see the orange Mexican bean beetle. But if you see those out there, you know those are the immature form of the Mexican bean beetle. And if you see some, you probably have a lot. So you want to hand pick those and destroy them as best you can. And I'm saying that they look, the mature form of the Mexican bean beetle looks kind of similar to the lady beetle, which is beneficial. So it's good to just notice those differences. So the Mexican bean beetle is much more orange, and the head, or I don't know all the correct entomological terms, but you know, the head here is like orange, whereas on the convergent lady beetle, it's black. So they do look quite different when you look closely at them.
Holly, we have another question.
Sure.
When I dig in the ground all the time, I find white grubs with dark heads, sort of crescent shaped. Are they pest grubs?
That is a great question, and I do not know the answer to that, and I want to find out because I find those grubs as well. My guess is that they are pest grubs. It's possible that some of them may be beneficial beetles. So I usually just kill them because I'm afraid that they are pest grubs, but the right thing to do would be to try to identify them, you know, take the time, and I resolve to do this, and I'm sorry I don't know the answer for you right now, but take the time to look them up, get a really good picture of them with your smartphone, and then go on to a search engine and try to match them up with something that you find and see if you can identify them. You could also take a really good picture or multiple pictures, and you could send that into your extension office, and they could help you identify it. So moving on to one that I do know, the green beneficial insect. You can see on the far left here, this is the egg at the top of this little thin filament. And the green lacewings, they lay their eggs on a little stem like that to protect it from ants and other insects that are crawling along the leaf. So some of those insects that would eat the eggs, they don't look up, so they don't see that the green lacewing egg is floating above their head. So I think that's pretty cool. And then when the egg hatches, the first stage of development is this little guy here, and this is when this plant when this insect is the most beneficial to us. It's a voracious feeder on aphids and other soft-bodied insects. So that's what it lives on 100%. After it's in this stage of development, it goes into like a chrysalis form, and then it develops into the adult form, which is this green lacewing that is probably the most recognizable. And the adults will eat a little bit of insects, but they mostly like to feed on flowers. So just a few more insects I want to look at. One more beneficial, this is a spine soldier bug. And this one is important. It's really important because it has 50 types of prey. So it'll eat all kinds of caterpillars. They will eat Mexican bean beetles, cornworms, diamondback moths, corn earworms, just all kinds of different things. They're really, really hungry little insects that eat a lot of pest insects, and they eat them at different stages of their life. So in the middle, you can see the younger stage, and you can see this one is eating a caterpillar right here. And then in the far right, you can see they do look like a stink bug, because they are a stink bug, but they are a beneficial stink bug. And the characteristic that really defines them are these spined shoulders. So you can see at the shoulders of the mature form, they are really spiky. So look really carefully at a stink bug before you smash it, because it could be a spine soldier bug. And this is a picture of a spine soldier bug attacking and killing a Mexican bean beetle larva. So there you go.
Holly, we have a question.
Sure.
I will have to start looking up insects before I start picking them off. I accidentally killed bracknioid wasps on my banana peppers. So just a good idea to start looking.
Yeah, definitely. We gotta like just take the time and figure out what it is we're looking at, because we definitely want to save the beneficial ones. Yeah. So one last lookalike. This is that spine soldier bug that we were just talking about, and you can see that real, that little spiny shoulder. And then on the right, we have a pest stink bug. This is the brown marmorated stink bug, and it is a major pest of farmers and backyard growers. They are non-selective, so they eat all different kinds of plant families. Crop rotation is not going to save you from the brown marmorated stink bug. They suck the sugars out of the fruit, so they will feed on parts of the fruit, and they suck the sugars out, and so you end up with these dead spots, necrotic spots on your fruit. And you can eat it if it's been attacked by the brown marmorated stink bug, but it's not very pretty, and you lose some of your fruit that's been feasted on by this pest. So you can see that the shoulders of the brown marmorated stink bug are much smoother and rounded. They don't have that really distinct spike. And the other thing to look at with the brown marmorated to look for is this little white band on their antenna. That is the discerning factor that tells you that you're dealing with the brown marmorated stink bug. It's got that little white band on its antenna. And if you see that, that is one that you should smash or collect and kill somehow, because that will grow up to be a pest in the garden. So spiders, these are another one that I consider to be beneficial in my garden. There are 38,000 at least named species of spiders in the world, and there are only 4 in the US that are poisonous to humans. So that's many thousands of spiders that are here that are not poisonous to humans, and if they bite you, you're not going to have any major issues. They are non-selective carnivores, so they will eat beneficial insects as well as pest insects, but they just help to keep a balance in the garden. So as an organic gardener, what we want to reach is balance in the system. And so we're allowing there to be populations of a lot of different kinds of organisms. We just don't want any one population to get out of control. And so spiders can help just keep everything at a manageable size, keep the populations at a manageable size. So if you just learn these 2 poisonous ones in Tennessee, the black widow on the left and the brown recluse on the right, learn those 2, and then any other spider that you come across, you can assume that it is non-poisonous, and you can leave it and let it help your garden achieve balance. So let's look at a few methods to attract beneficial insects. Perennial plantings are great. So that means having some areas of the garden that are undisturbed. So you're not cleaning them out every year. Your plants are, there year round, coming back year round, and it's like a less disturbed area. It's great if you could have some wild, unkept areas. If you have somewhere off to the side that you can let be a little bit messy, that can help provide shelter for beneficial insects. Mulch is a good thing to have. Many beetles like to hide in the mulch. Many beneficial beetles. It's good to have an accessible water source. So, if you think about a bird bath, they're up high and they are probably not going to be accessible for some of these smaller insects. So if you can put a water source low to the ground, that will better serve some of your beneficial insects. And you want to minimize pesticides, right? So the less often you spray, the more likely you are to have some of these beneficial insects around. Insect hotels are another cool way to attract beneficial insects. And this is something that's gaining popularity. You put a lot of different materials and you can get really artistic with it. But you're providing nesting sites or, shelter for different insects. You can put, like this one has in the top right, you can see these logs that have holes that have been drilled into them. Those can be used by some solitary bees. So this is just kind of a fun way, like maybe if you couldn't provide a wild unkept area or you didn't want to provide that, you could possibly look at putting in an insect hotel. And yes, you might attract some pest insects as well, but you could experiment with it and see who shows up, and some of them hopefully would be beneficial. I think it is pretty effective just because it's so popular and it's been around for so long. I've been seeing them for 7+ years, and I know they've been being used for longer than that. So to me, that says that they probably, people are having some success with them. So probably my favorite thing that I do to attract beneficial insects is to provide them with lots of flowers. So flowers from the Apiaceae family or the carrot family, those are really great for attracting beneficial insects. Parsley, coriander, dill. A lot of these beneficials have really small mouth parts and they need flowers that are open and easily accessible so they can get to that nectar and pollen. And these fit that description. Plants.
We have a question.
Sure.
Where's the best place to put an insect hotel?
I would say you want to have it, let's see, I'm trying to remember. I feel like it's like east facing. If you don't want to orient it towards the south, because if you think about, the sun, that's going to be the most sun exposure. If you can put it in a little bit of a sheltered spot, that's nice. If it can have some protection from rain, that will keep it from getting soggy and help keep your materials fresh. So those are the two main things I think, is provide a little bit of protection with maybe some type of covering for a roof. And ideally you would have it like east or north facing. I think east would be ideal because you do want to be getting a little bit of sun, but you want to avoid full sun all day long, and you probably wouldn't want it to be west facing because you would get too much of that hot afternoon sun. So I would put it just, in my vegetable garden and try to face it to the east and give it some protection from rain. Oh, and someone's commenting near a good water source too, right? So if you're providing water for your insects, it would be good to, you could place your insect hotel near that water. And so you want to treat your hotel guests well and make sure they have everything they need. So yeah, provide some water close by. Or if you had like a little pond on your property, you could put it near the pond. So Asteraceae family, that's great. You really want these classic flowers. Like it's best to look at the flowers, like native flowers or wonderful flowers that have been around for years and years and years, these tend to be better because a lot of the insects have evolved over time. They've co-evolved with the plants, and so they're attracted to them. And a lot of the newer breeding has been focused more on just the beauty of the flower, the size of the petals, and often the breeders haven't looked at pollen production or nectar production, and so that has sometimes diminished that pollen and nectar as a resource. So sticking with the classics is a great idea, and if you want to get a really good population of classic flowers, you know, chamomile, tansy, yarrow, asters, then you can add in some of those frilly hybrids as well, as long as you have a lot of the good old-fashioned ones as sort of a backbone for your garden to make sure that the beneficials have plenty of nectar and pollen. Plants in the mint family are also great. All the mints, hyssop, catnip, those are all good. Borage is one that I grow at UT, and it's really popular with bees. Buckwheat is a cover crop, and it is really, every time I grow buckwheat, it's covered with ladybugs and honeybees, and all kinds of good insects come to the buckwheat. Holy basil, this is one that you don't see on a lot of lists, but I always put it on my list just because of my own observations. It is covered in little tiny flying insects that I'm pretty sure are parasitic wasps. And I just grew the holy basil to grow it for tea, but I found that when I let it flower, it was so attractive to a wide variety of tiny flying insects that I've continued to grow it every year because I want to attract all of those little tiny pollinators and the braconid wasps, the parasitic wasps. So switching gears a little bit here, we're going to look at a few insect pests. These are ones that I've seen in my garden, and I just want to look at them with you guys. Squash bugs, they're bad. They are a vector for a bacterial disease, and they're very, very common. The best thing to do with squash bugs is to try to catch them and kill them. So scouting on a daily basis is really important. And you can put a board out in the garden overnight, like a 2x4. And when you come early in the morning, if you put it out next to your squash plants, come early in the morning and you can turn that board up. And you'll often see a lot of squash bugs will have congregated there overnight. And you can carefully put the board back down, hopefully not disturbing them too much so they fly away, and then you just stomp on the board, and you can take out quite a few squash bugs that way. You can also use duct tape that's wrapped backwards, you know, inside out, so the sticky side is out. Wrap it around your hand, and you can use that to scout for pests, and then just stick it right onto the squash bugs, and they'll stick to that, and then you can kill them. So scouting is really important with squash bugs. Harlequin bug, this is a major pest for me. Mostly what I do is hand pick this, and I just take a bucket of soapy water, and I'm out there hand picking these harlequin bugs off, finding their eggs and smashing their eggs. You can see they have that sort of hard layer on, you know, over their wings, and that protects them from a lot of insecticides, so they can be hard to kill with insecticides. So it's really good to just scout for them, hand pick them off, and kill them that way. Aphids, I think we're all familiar with aphids. This is, you know, an example of some yellow aphids. I often just use my hands, if I've got gloves on, to just pull the aphids right off and smash them in my fingers. Or you can use a heavy stream of water. The aphids attach their whole mouth to the plant, and they have, you know, the piercing, sucking mouth part. And so when you blast them off with water, this is gruesome, but what you're actually doing is breaking their mouth off. And so when they fall to the ground, they're not getting back up again. So it is really effective. You can just hold the plant in place with one hand and take a strong stream of water and just blast them off with the other hand. It works pretty well. And then also just attracting all those beneficial insects that we just talked about all of those guys love to feed on aphids.
Holly, we have a question.
Sure.
How big is the harlequin bug?
It's about as big as the fingernail, and well, as I'd say like somewhere between my thumbnail and my index fingernail. It's about that big. They're not too big. They're really pretty, but they vector a disease. I'm pretty sure they vector a disease as well, and they are so many of them, and they just feed on the plants, and the plants just can't withstand the pressure. The cucumber beetles, they can either be striped or spotted. They also are a vector for a bacterial disease, which means when they feed on a plant, they often transmit a disease. So not only are they sucking the sugars out of your plant, but they are also injecting it, passively, or they don't mean to, but they're passively transmitting a bacterial disease. So that's why you'll often see your cucumbers just melting. It's because they've had cucumber beetles and the beetles have given them a bacterial disease. I don't have a great cure for cucumber beetles. I hunt for them and try to catch them. They're actually pretty quick. They can be hard to catch. I usually just plant successive crops of cucumbers, and so I'll plant them in different areas in the garden, and I find that way I'm able to get to harvest some cucumbers before they're taken down by pests and diseases. And then hopefully I have another crop that's growing on in a different part of the garden, and I'm able to harvest some of those, and so I keep it going that way. This is that squash vine borer that we looked at on another slide. And just, here's that grub. Again, that's going to be inside the stem of the zucchini. And on the right, you can see this is what the adult moth looks like. It's has sort of red and black and a big fat body. So if you see that moth in the garden, it's pretty distinct, and it's not one that you want to encourage or promote, because it's gonna eat your zucchini plants.
Holly, we have a question.
Sure.
And somebody's kind of addressed it too. Is the squash bug different from the stink bug?
Yes, the squash bug is different. So you can see here, I went back to the slide, it's longer, it's much longer. I am not an entomologist, but I suspect that they are related. But the squash bug is, like I said, it's bigger. I think that's what, oh yeah, and someone has answered here that they're saying that stink bugs are wider. That's also true. Yeah, the squash bug is more narrow and it's longer. So some other beneficial organisms that live in the garden. This is, one of our campers last summer that was helping us to harvest our sweet potatoes here. I put this to remind me to talk about cleanliness in the garden. So, you being out in the garden, harvesting your fruits and vegetables and keeping it clean, this is going to help you to avoid having a buildup of pests and diseases. I consider turtles to be beneficial, if anything, just because they're really cute. No, but they're omnivores, so they might take like 1 or 2 bites out of a tomato or some of your fruits and vegetables, but they're also eating insects, so they're helping to create balance in the garden. Snakes, love them or hate them, they are beneficial in the garden. We have black snakes, I think they're rat snakes at UT Gardens. We have a few of them, and they eat mice and baby bunnies, and they are extremely helpful. So when I see the snake in the garden, I steer clear of it, but I'm happy to see them there because I know they're helping. Birds can be considered pests, but I consider them to be part of the system. They are going to be eating weed seeds, they're going to be eating insects, they're going to be making babies, they're going to be feeding their babies insects, and they can eat, hundreds and if not thousands of insects every day. So they can be helpful in the garden. And then even your lizards, blue-tailed skinks, these are going to be non-selective carnivores, but they're going to be eating all kinds of different insects in the garden. So I consider them to be a beneficial part of the garden community. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about some of the bigger, the macroorganisms that are pests, slugs and snails. So this guy is not something that y'all have to worry about, but this is a giant African land snail, and I put this here to help us feel how fortunate we are that we don't have to deal with slugs that are and snails that are as big as rats. And this one has been introduced into parts of Florida, and they do not have any natural predators. They have up to 1,000 eggs per year, and they are as big as a rat. So we might be suffering with our slugs and our snails, but at least we don't have them that big. But what do we do with our slugs and snails? How do we control the ones that we do have? We can use mechanical methods, and that means getting out there, picking them by hand, killing them however you see fit. I'll let your imagination run wild here. But, you know, scouting for them and just suck it up and kill it the minute you see it. That's what I recommend. Iron phosphate is a good option for slugs and snails. This is a non-toxic method that it comes in little pellets, and you can put those out and the slugs and snails ingest it. It disrupts their digestive system and kills them, and it's non-toxic to pets. Beer is another method that some people like to use for slugs and snails. It's not my favorite because it tends to be a little bit messy and smelly, but it can work. If you put out little dishes of beer, they crawl into it and they drink it and they die. Ducks and chickens are another thing to consider. Ducks are great for controlling slugs and snails. And also, scientists have found that crabgrass can be toxic to these slugs and snails. And so some gardeners have found they can take crabgrass and mix it with chopped dried leaves and corn bran, and you can put those little cakes out, and apparently that can be toxic to slugs and snails. That's just one more option to consider. Rabbits, let's just look real quick at rabbits. They can be a major pest. I think the biggest thing, the most effective thing that you can do is to put up a fence. When you are fencing for rabbits, two main things that you want to think about. You want to make sure that the holes of your fencing are small enough that the rabbits can't sneak through, because they can squeeze through holes that are, you know, if it's bigger than 3 inches wide. So you do want to have some small holes. And then the other key thing is that you really need to bury your fence. So you want to go 6 to 8 inches below the ground, and that's what I have in this top right picture here circled. You can see the ground level, and then this fence, they've actually dug a trench, and then you bury the fence in that down in there about 6 to 8 inches, because the rabbits will dig. So excuse me, if you want to get serious about it, you need to dig a trench and really make your fence secure. You can also use repellent sprays for bunnies. I have used hot pepper spray with mixed results. One issue with the sprays is that they do wash off in the rain, so you have to reapply them, but it can be marginally effective. Thorny plants are another option, and they can work. The key with that is you have to do so many of them, and they have to be thick enough that they're actually going to act as a barrier to keep the rabbits out. The other thing you can do is encourage those natural enemies. So hawks, owls, foxes, and snakes, you know, these are all things that some of them we might be like scared of if we see them out in the garden, but if we can tolerate them and even encourage them, they can help to control some of these things like bunnies and mice that can be problematic. Deer, I'm going to say fencing. That is the one way to keep deer out. If you really want to keep deer out, you need to put up a tall, sturdy fence. So it's got to be tall enough that the deer cannot jump over it. You could add some electricity in there and give them a shock. If you live in a really wooded area, like my dad does, you might be able to use this method where he has taken fishing line and he's tied it all around the perimeter of his property, kind of far out, but he tied it to trees all around the perimeter of where he's growing his vegetables. and then he's attached tin cans to it in different locations, and he tied the fishing line so it's just at the level of the neck of a deer. So when the deer are running through the property, they crash right into that. They don't see it because it's the fishing line, but they crash into it, and then the cans rattle and it freaks them out and scares them and they run off. That's been effective for him for going on 15 years. So that's only one case, but that's something that you might try if you have the trees and the space to be able to try that. But again, fencing, you know, the most successful deer protection is going to be just put a big old strong fence around your garden. You can also do repellent sprays, and this is something that you would probably want to do more for ornamentals than for your vegetable garden, because you would like to consider adding coyote urine to the repellent spray. I do have personal experience with this. I lived in Washington State and had a job as a gardener there, and we would mix together milk, eggs, coyote urine, and Tabasco, and we put it in backpack sprayers, and we would spray the plants, like the shrubs that were really susceptible to deer browsing, and it worked really well. It is similar to the hot pepper spray in that when a rain comes, it washes off, so you have to reapply it, but that's a little alternative method. And then the other option is to just plant deer-resistant plants, and this probably only applies to us ornamental gardeners, but you know, there are a lot of plants that deer don't love, and so you can really do your research and find which plants are going to be less tasty to deer and rely on those. I want to talk real quick about solarization, because this is a really effective form of soil-borne disease control. And so there are a lot of soil-borne pathogens that can be controlled by solarizing or burning your soil. And these are just a few examples. There's a lot of different fungus issues can be controlled this way, bacteria, and those pesky root knot nematodes. You can eradicate many of them by solarizing or burning your soil. And the few main things you want to think about here, you got to use clear plastic. That's going to trap the most heat in. And you have to do it, you have one window of time in Tennessee when you can really do it effectively, and that is coming up June through August, and that's when the temperatures really get high enough to effectively solarize the soil. And you got to leave it on for 4 to 6 weeks, and you're hoping to reach temperatures of 110 to 125 degrees for a sustained period of time. But it is really effective at killing those soil-borne pathogens as well as destroying weed seeds. And I think it actually can be effective for the Bermuda grass. So it's something that I would like to try for Bermuda grass, and that's another one for the participant who was looking for a way to kill the Bermuda grass. Solarization has potential, and that's something you might want to look into. If you're interested to learn more, UT does have an extension publication, and I put the link here, or you can just go to any search engine and type in UT extensions soil solarization, and you will find this free publication. But it is specific to our area, and it goes into great detail about the methods for doing this. So finishing up here, we got about 4 more slides. I want to talk about these chemical controls. So we've looked at all these different things that you can try and strategies that you can use. But it may be that you want to use chemical controls, or you need to for some reason. And so 2 main things I want to look at with chemical controls or think about. The first one is that it's really important to correctly identify your problem. So you want to be sure that you understand what it is you're working with, and so that can help you choose which spray to use, because you don't want to waste your time and money spraying for the wrong thing. So it's really important that you identify what the problem really is. And then once you understand what the problem is, take some time to do a little bit of research to look at the life cycle of the pest or disease. With a lot of pests, they have a point in their life cycle where they're the most vulnerable, and that's when you want to spray them with the insecticide. And with diseases, there are often places in the disease cycle where there's nothing you can do. And so you really need to, as in if you spray, it's possible that the disease is already so far advanced or it's at a part in its cycle where it can't be affected by the spray. So you need to do a little bit of research, find out what the problem is, and then you need to find out, what is the cycle of that problem so that you can really target your spray at the right time to really get the most bang for your buck and to really have it be effective. So there are 3 types of organic pesticides that we're going to look at. 3 main types. There are botanicals, and those are going to be derived from plants. There are the biologicals, and those come from living organisms, and then oils and soaps. So biological insecticides, these are, for the most part, or these 2 that we're looking at right here, are derived from different types of bacteria. So BT comes from a bacteria called Bacillus thuringiensis, and it is a bacteria that it harms, it kills caterpillars. So if you have like cabbage moths, those little pretty white moths that are such a pest in the cabbage and broccoli families, you can use this BT powder, and it is quite effective at eradicating those caterpillars. Serenade is one that's pretty popular, and it comes from a different type of bacteria, and it can be effective at treating soil-borne issues. It comes from the soil, but it can be used to treat things like leaf blight, black mold, powdery mildew, and a lot of other diseases. So that's another one that is naturally derived and can be used in an organic setting. For the botanical insecticides and fungicides, these are a couple examples. When you see the pyrethrins and neem, those are plants, and they are effective as pesticides and sometimes for disease control as well. A lot of these botanicals, and I've talked about this before, but a lot of the insecticides in general, they will kill beneficial insects as well. So that's why we want to be really mindful and purposeful with when and where we use them. And then another thing to know about the botanicals specifically is that they do break down in intense sunlight. And so it's a good idea to put them out early in the day or late in the day when the sun is not as intense, so that you get that fuller, more concentrated form that's going to be more effective. And again, insects can develop resistance. And so if you're relying on one of these types of organic sprays, insects can develop a resistance to it, and so you may need to switch your spray and try a different thing to continue to have an effective application, throughout the growing season. Something that works early in the season, it's possible that same thing may not be as lethal later in the season because the insects have developed some resistance to it. It's important to use a respirator and wash your skin after applying any of these insecticides. It's important to remember that, just because something is organic or natural doesn't mean it's non-toxic. So in general, it's a good idea to, make sure that you're wearing personal protection. Always read the label and read the directions and pay attention, take care of yourself, wear a respirator so you can protect your lungs, and take care. The mineral-based fungicides and irritants, these are just a few examples. You got your diatomaceous earth, sulfur and copper. These are both used more for disease control. Iron phosphate, that's the one I mentioned for slugs and snails. Sluggo is just a brand name for that. It's pretty effective. And then you've got your oils and insecticidal soaps. So there are a lot of different sprays and applications that you can find out there, and you just want to be sure that you have correctly identified your problem and that you're applying your spray at the optimum time to be the most effective. So that is all I have for today. Thanks so much for joining us. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer questions today, or you can email me. This is my email address right here. And again, thanks a lot.
Holly, we do have a question. Someone said he has a fig tree with a pile of ants. Any advice?
I don't know right off the top of my head. I have been using that neem oil for ants in the kitchen garden, and it is somewhat effective, but what I found is that I feel like what happens is you put the neem on and it doesn't actually kill the ants, it just makes them move away. So that's something. There are a lot of poisons that you can use. I don't want to recommend those hardcore poisons, but if they're fire ants, you may need to resort to some stronger chemical application. I'm sorry, but I don't have an answer for that. In fact, when you come across an answer, if you could please email me and help me by sharing a solution that you might find. I'd love a new solution because I have a lot of ants in my garden at UT, and I'm not really sure what to do with them. I keep putting neem on them, but I think they're just moving around. So also, though, you could poke the mound, stab it, and disturb it, and try to destroy it. And that also is not going to kill them, but it's going to make them move.
Holly, someone asked about acidifying soil for blueberries, but I'm going to respond if it's okay with you and tell her we did that last week, and that video should be up on YouTube pretty soon.
Sure. Yeah. It's yep. She can check it out there, and it's sulfur basically.
Okay. Okay. All right. Well, thanks everybody. Thanks for joining us today. And again, we hope to get this recording up online soon. It'll be up on our YouTube channel, the UT Gardens YouTube channel. Thank you very much.
Thanks everyone. Bye.